when my dad was sick, he was surrounded by all these big machines and they were supposed to help make his life better. But he felt so alienated and afraid of them that it created anxiety. And that was such a revelation for me. It was so clear that there's such a big difference between what a robot is capable of doing versus how relatable it is, how it makes us feel.
That's roboticist Catie Cuan, and she's the founder and CEO of Art Lab. ART stands for AI, Robotics, and Technology. And she has a weird job.
I teach robots how to dance, which I think is becoming a lot less weird since there are going to be so many more robots and we're going to need them to interact with people.
Catie is also a dancer, a really accomplished one. She danced at the Metropolitan Opera Ballet, had her own dance company, and estimates that she may have danced with more robots than anyone else alive. Catie was an artist in residence at Google X, where she worked on problems like how self-driving cars and office cleaning robots should interact with the people around them without unnerving us. She is very aware of the science fiction and horror films that make us wary of robots, but she says robots don't have to be cold, sterile, and brutal. They can dance, and we can dance with them. And Catie also believes that robots can help us escape the drudgery of looking at small screens all the time.
What does our interaction with computing look like in the future? I want it to be a lot more embodied. I want to be able to stand up and move around and speak and gesture.
Catie's doing fascinating work at the edge of what's possible, so stay tuned for a sneak peek at what our life with robots might look like. Welcome to Future Around and Find Out, where we celebrate the breakthroughs, call BS on the hype, and explore how things might go sideways and how we, together, can steer the future in the right direction. Hi, I'm Dan Blumberg. I'm an independent technologist and former NPR journalist, and on the show, you'll hear sharp takes on what builders need to know now. Learn more, sign up for the newsletter, and ask questions of upcoming guests at futurearound.com. So you're building for a future where there will be billions of robots. We'll work with them. We'll go home to them. Can you paint a picture for us of what that might look like and why we want that?
Right now, the primary ways that we use intelligence and computing are our laptops and our cell phones. And obviously, those things have been incredibly impactful and meaningful in terms of how we communicate, how we do our work. And the big difference between a robot and a computer is that a robot is embodied. It takes up three-dimensional space, which means that it can do things in the physical world, not only in the digital world. What does that mean for our everyday lives? Well, you'll wake up at home. Right now, we have Roombas. We'll have robots that clean other things in our homes. This could be loading and unloading the dishwasher, folding the laundry. When you go outside and navigate down the street, we already see a lot of robots, also known as Waymos,
Yep.
autonomous vehicles here in San Francisco. So these are robots that are driving themselves around. I personally love taking Waymos places because I feel really safe inside of them. We also tend to have opportunities that are not only in our day-to-day lives. I think this is things like autonomously cleaning solar panels. It's a tough job for a human to be doing with a window washing tool over and over. It's a great job for a robot. Same goes for picking different kinds of agriculture inside of vertical farms. Similar, I think, for people like my dad who want to be able to live at home independently for longer. He's now in his late 70s. I think about how to ensure that he maintains his cognitive acuity. There's some interesting new robots like LEQ, which is a senior companion robot where you can tell stories, hear jokes back and forth, and engage with them socially as a way of maintaining some of your cognitive sharpness. And the macro comment that I can make about why this is important is that really every continent across the world, the population is expected to decrease in the next century, except in Africa. We're seeing these big declines in birth rates all around the planet. So I think labor demand is either going to be constant or go up. And without as many humans to be able to perform that labor, I think we're going to need augmentation and assistance from robots.
So you founded Art Lab recently, and one of the key things that you're focused on is what you call the interaction gap between what a robot is capable of doing and also how they make us feel while doing it. Can you describe what that gap is and what you're doing to make these interactions with robots feel good?
It's exactly the very first source of inspiration that I observed back in 2014, which is these machines that my when my dad was sick in the hospital, he was surrounded by all these big machines, and they were supposed to help make his life better and keep him safe and monitor all of his vitals. But he felt so alienated and afraid of them that it affected him emotionally so much that it created anxiety, and it didn't lead to the kinds of climate that would give him better and better health outcomes. And that was such a revelation for me. It was so clear that there's such a big difference between what a robot is capable of doing, the kinds of tasks that it can perform, how strong and precise it is, versus how relatable it is, how it makes us feel. And there was very canonical work in this area and from Professor Anka Dragan, who's actually now at UC Berkeley, back when she was doing her PhD at CMU, which looked at motion that is functional is not necessarily the same as motion that's legible. So motion that's clear to us as people is not necessarily motion that is functional for a robot to get around. And so I think when I think about the interaction gap, it's the difference between what do I as a human think the robot's doing, anticipate where it's going, feel about it, versus what is the ground truth for what that robot's supposed to be doing. And as roboticists, we don't spend enough time in that space. I'll give you an example. During my PhD from 2018 to 2023, I spent 3 years of my PhD at Google working on a project called Everyday Robots. Google X is the big research and development arm of Google. They had a project called Everyday Robots, which at the time was one of the most not only well-funded, but technically sophisticated robotics and AI moonshots on the planet. And we had about 200 robots that were autonomously navigating Google buildings, doing all kinds of tasks, wiping tables, sorting trash, resetting conference rooms. But these robots were not great at navigating socially around people. So if you had two humans that were standing and facing each other in a hallway, and the robot needed to cross from to the other side of those humans, often it would perceive both of them as obstacles and drive straight through the center. Well, you or I would never do that to each other. If you were standing on one end of a hallway and you saw two people standing and facing each other, you would never walk through the center. I mean, that would be very cavalier and pretty
Yeah.
rude. And so it was things like that where we realized we needed to do more in order to demonstrate that the robots were capable, that they could go around people and detect obstacles, but also that they were intelligent and they were relatable and they would move in ways that were clear and legible to the humans that they were around. Because otherwise, we saw that as kind of a big barrier to adoption. If you're perceiving these robots that you're surrounded by as unsafe or unintelligent, you're far less likely to want to use them.
And so what is I know you're building something you call the vision language interaction model, which is different from other types of models that inform the movements of robots. Can you dig into that a little bit?
We have seen an explosion in these large capable models in the last few years. Large language models, LLMs, of course, we all know as ChatGPT or Claude Opus, Claude Sonnet, any choose your
Yep.
favorite alternative. Vision language models layer on top of that. So, vision language models, they're the kinds of models where you can look at an environment, look at an image, and then be able to describe it in natural text and language. On top of that, we built VLAs, so vision language action models, which basically took what am I learning about the environment through images, and then how can I map that to a series of low-level actions. We have invented a new kind of model that we're calling a vision language interaction model. So it sits on top of a VLA. What is unique about our model is that we condition the success or the failure of our task on the basis of a human response. So we're looking for how do people want to interact with this robot? And if I take this next action, anticipating what that human is thinking, feeling, asking for, if I take this next action, I can then rate how well I did based on how this human responds. So this is a model that moves from I'm a robot using a VLA that's moving a cup from here to here to now I'm a robot that can socially interact with a person and look at a much richer multimodal context that includes everything from the images and objects that are in the environment, but also what is the person saying? What are they doing? How are they gesturing and moving throughout the space? And that's where our VLI models, I mean, really, as we have these billions of robots in the future and billions of human beings, we're going to have trillions of these interactions moment by moment where humans and robots are going to have to understand one another in real time. And that's where our VLI models will be tremendously powerful.
So how are you getting the data and doing this training? I imagine there's a ton more sensors that are looking at facial expressions, or tell me more.
I'm a strong believer in vertical integration. I think you can't build a model in isolation. You actually need to deploy it on a standout product experience in order to build that data moat and improve your model over time, and also build a meaningful business, which is to have a product that you can actually sell and give to consumers. I can't talk yet about what the product is exactly that we're building, but we are indeed making a robot for the home. We actually are a little shy even sometimes to call it a robot because it doesn't look anything like you can imagine. Given my background in the arts, it's a very sophisticated object that you'll want to have inside of your home. And so we deploy our models on these devices. That's one way of collecting data, but I really want to emphasize that given how much is possible now with a lot of these small models, all of the data stays local on device. So we don't beam images, text, anything like that into the cloud. So we will have a product that we sell and deploy inside of the home. And in anticipation of that launch, we're building a ton of prototypes. We're doing this kind of learning, bootstrapping data collection inside of our office. And that's the test bed for how our models will improve and get better over time.
You mentioned using robots as a way to interact with today's LLMs. How would that help us? There's some physical reaction that's going to happen as we talk to it. Like, can you tease it out a little bit? I know you're working on it. You may not want to reveal too much, but can you share a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're used to interacting with the world in this embodied way. I mean, I think when you and I first met, it was in person. You're standing, you're excitedly moving your hands, you're gesturing, you're speaking back and forth, you're using your words, but it's just an embodied way of being in the world. I mean, I just am finishing this really beautiful book by Michael Pollan, which is called A World Appears, and it's about consciousness. And
Hmm.
Michael Pollan lives in Berkeley and goes to some of the same bakeries as me, so I'm I'm a little biased to like him, but he spends a good chunk of the book reminding himself that he has a body, which is amazing because he talks about sensation and the feelings that you have in the gut and how the brain actually serves to protect the body and take these feelings that are coming from the body, whether it's love, happiness, joy, or fear and anxiety, and then process them and decide what to pay attention to. And reading this through Michael Pollan's POV, it's very beautiful, his writing. And it was such a reminder for me of like almost every dancer I've ever spoken to knows this. They know that we are embodied, that our experience of the world is to move around inside of it with a body. Even there's a choreographer here in San Francisco, her name is Hope Moore, and she has a t-shirt that all her dancers used to wear, which said, "The body is the brain." And so there's something about a lot of our interfaces and tools today have done a very good job at narrowing our sensory experience to make us less embodied. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
You did the T-Rex. So it's like
Yeah.
the hunch.
Holding my mobile phone with my little thumbs.
Yeah,
Yes.
you're holding your mobile phone with your little thumbs and your whole experience. And again, in his book, Michael talks about the difference between this wide open awareness that you have when you're walking through a forest, because you're seeing all around you, you're hearing the sounds, you're feeling the crunch of the leaves under your feet, versus the feeling that you have when you're hunched on a subway and you've got your two little beady eyes staring into this small screen. And so I think about what does our interaction with computing look like in the future? I want it to be a lot more embodied. I want to be able to stand up and move around and speak and gesture and be in different locations and just like have the experience of computing be more diffuse and not so constrained to this one surface. And I think because of how sophisticated voice interaction has gotten, and of course, pose recognition and bodily awareness. I think this is possible now. And that to me it feels like the future. It feels like a world where I am interacting with a robot as a entry point into AI, LLMs, and computing, but I don't have to sit in this
Yeah.
small posture. I can just be. And that's the world I want to live in.
You said that the robot that you're working on now, like you hesitate to even call it a robot. It may not look like a robot. Like, what's the shape that these should take? I mean, are they, there's a lot of attention on humanoids right now. I'm curious what your take is on whether robots should look like us or not. But how do you approach more the bigger question? Like, how do you approach what shape a robot should take?
Humanoids have really captured some of the tech imagination these days.
Yeah.
It's gone to a little bit of an extreme. Rodney Brooks, who's a legend in our field, former MIT professor, co-founded iRobot, made the Baxter robot, now is doing Robust AI, says this thing where he's like, the closer you build a robot to a human form, the higher people's expectations are for it. And we can't help ourselves, right? Our mirror neurons go nuts and we start thinking,
Mm-hmm.
oh, there's this bilaterally symmetric, two arm, two leg,
Yep.
roughly same proportion, roughly same height, oriented the same way because it's got these front facing eyes. And we're animals. You can't help but have these heightened expectations for what that robot is going to be able to do. Not only physically in terms of how it moves, this is where we run into the same uncanny valley question when sometimes they move in ways that are stuttery or scary or they fall over. But also your expectations for how intelligent that machine is
Yeah.
go way through the roof when you see it looking like a humanoid. I personally don't want to give myself that design challenge yet. I think that it's useful. I think in some very specific vertical applications, having a humanoid is the best form factor, but I don't think it's always the best one. And I can give a few more examples. Henry Ford built cars that were on wheels. The prevailing transportation standard at the time was a horse. He did not make cars with legs. Similarly, when we were at Google, the robots that we built had wheels. That was just much more efficient from a power standpoint. And we had elevators everywhere because we were operating in ADA compliant buildings. And so, as long as the robot could push the elevator button, which it could, it
Yeah.
would be able to get itself up and down stairs. So, I
Is
think
an
it,
elevator itself a robot, by the way?
yes, is an elevator itself a robot? I still find myself to this day in love with machines of many different kinds, with the simplicity, the elegance. I mean, I have an elevator in my building now, and I'm like, I can't believe they invented this, a long time ago, and it's still, every time I get off of a plane, I'm amazed. Every
Right.
time I take a flight somewhere, I'm like, the amount of engineering, the number of human engineering hours that went into creating this experience for me is mind-boggling. And I'm always in awe. And I feel that way mostly about robots too, but I think some of them could be designed in slightly different ways. So I think for me, I wouldn't say I'm either bullish or bearish on humanoids. I think that we need to invite ourselves to broaden our imaginations about what robots can be. For example, I spent a couple years as the artist in residence at the Exploratorium here in San Francisco. And during that period, I made a 9 foot high robot hand on a mobile base with 16 cable actuated joints, and the fingers could go all the way forward and all the way back. So it was both a right and a left hand. And people, I mean, I don't know that I would have expected to make a 9 foot high robot hand along with everybody else on the team. We had a really fabulous team, but it wound up being the right way to express the themes of the project. How I think about robot design, I think it's so exciting because it's really unbounded. I mean, you can have robot design be 100% driven by the nature of the application, right? Like, let's say you have a 3 kilogram payload and you need that to be supported at specific distances and whatever, you can really quickly kind of come up with a series of mechanical design calculations that tell you what are some of the attributes of the robot. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be a certain color or a certain material or um, move in a specific way. Besides that, I think we can be really imaginative about what our future looks like with robots. And in doing so, it feels more of a capacious vision about the future.
Yeah. I don't spend nearly as much time with robots as you do, but I did just go to South by Southwest. So of course I saw a humanoid with a cowboy hat. And also more recently I was at Web Summit in Portugal, where there were also robots kind of wandering around the big tech conference floor, including one that was dancing, kind of doing the Macarena. I bet you would have taught it something more interesting than that. And it was sort of interacting with people. People swarmed it and were around it, and it was waving. People would wave back, and I tried to give it a fist bump, but it didn't know what that meant. Or maybe it learned from me. I don't know. There was also some caninoid robots, and I was like, I have seen that Black Mirror episode. I'm going to get away from this thing. This is really creepy. People were like petting it like a dog, right?
Mhm.
Because it was dog shaped. I don't know why we need them to be human shaped. I think maybe I'm closer to what you were saying. Like, I feels unnecessary. It feels like something we just took from the Jetsons or something like that they have. Although even Rosie had wheels, right?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I'll go through, especially if I'm giving a talk to high school kids or things like that, and I look at a lot of fictional representations of robots. To your point about Black Mirror, and there's a lot of stories that are pretty adversarial and not great for humans. And in a lot of those stories, you have these shiny humanoid robots. And as an industrial designer, I'd be like, is that really the reference that I want people to have
Right.
when they look at my product for the first time, as some recollection of iRobot or Terminator? I'm not sure. I think this is where we suffer from a lack of imagination. And it's incredibly meaningful because I think we're in this circular environment where artists will often create a vision of a fictional future, whether that's in books or movies. And then engineers, especially in their young life, will go and see those stories and become very influenced by them and
Yeah.
use that as inspiration for what they want to build in the future, or even for opening their eyes about what's possible to build. And then we as artists will then observe what's happening in the engineering zeitgeist and think, oh man, is this really the future and the society that we want to support? And this is where I think artists have a tremendous amount of power. One of my favorite quotes on this is from William Gibson, who's a fiction writer. And he says, if you want to know where a new technology is headed, look at what the artists and criminals are doing with it. Meaning these are people who are operating on the fringe, right? On the edge, who are in these
Yeah.
outer distributions. And this is where I think the kinds of stories that we tell, the way that we introduce or even describe relationships between humans and robots, deeply meaningful and do wind up affecting the things that we build in the future.
Are there favorite moments from science fiction or Wally or anywhere else that like inspire you?
Oh, what a great question. I'm a Wally fan for sure, like everyone. I mean, I'm a
Yeah.
diehard Pixar kid. I grew up, I think, in the heyday of Disney. I
Yeah.
mean, like when you would get all of them on VHS, and this is how you know I'm a true millennial. And they were those plasticky VHSs that had the flip feeling when
Yeah.
you close them. Anyway,
Yeah.
so that's how I saw all the Disney movies, whether it was Lion King or Little Mermaid or anything like that. But no, I mean, I think Wally for sure. My work, I would say, more so has been impacted by other artists who've been working with a lot of these tools. I mean, William Forsythe is one. He's a very decorated choreographer, built a piece called Black Flags now a couple, maybe almost 20 years ago, with these giant industrial robot arms where they were swinging these enormous black flags around, and you could feel the wind in the air that was being generated by the robots. And he had a very simple jumping off point, which was, I've taught a human a dance with a robot. Could I have this robot also perform the same dance while holding this object? And I loved that contrast between the hard industrialization of the robot and the softness of the fabric. That's shown up in a lot of my work. I've also taken some inspiration. There was a project that also happened a couple decades ago at MIT at CSAIL with Pilabolus, which is a very well-known dance company, where they had a drone moving around the stage and a human dancer who was treating it almost as if it was this mythical entity. And he was playing the role of a caveman, and the drone was. And I thought, our minds are so predisposed to layering narrative and story on top of everything that even with the faintest of cues, you can create an entire fictional narrative. And that piece, for example, was impactful for me. And so I tend to draw, yes, some inspiration from fiction, whether that's movies and books, and certainly from my other fellow artists and researchers who've been in the field.
Yeah. What's it like? You've said you may have danced with more robots than anyone alive. Like what's it like to dance with robots? What's it taught you about your own movement?
I have been dancing almost my entire life. My dad says if you don't know how to dance, you're probably not Cuban, which my family's Cuban. And so I've grown up social dancing and then also taking dance classes and lessons and being a performer on big stages and small stages. When you're performing with a human being, in many cases, it's likely they've had the same amount of training that you have. And as a human dancer, you learn with that training what is not only going to keep you safe, but also this other person. And you can communicate with your eyes and your breath. And there's norms that get established. For example, if you're doing a big lift into the air, you have specific timing on that lift for when you're going to go into the air. And that makes you feel very safe every single time. And I love dancing with people. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's what I've spent most of my life doing as a performing artist. When I started dancing with robots, it was a completely surreal sensation because what I would do is sit at a computer and program something that I wanted. So I had this very seated, digital experience. And then I would stand up and move around with this thing that I had just programmed. And I felt like I was imbuing myself into the computer, then into the robot. And then I could interact with this version of me that was translated through space time into some completely different agent. And it was so mind boggling. And I felt myself on this long continuum of humans and our tools. This is one of the things that defines us as a species is our ability to build and leverage tools because we're not particularly strong, we're not
Yeah.
particularly fast, we don't fly, we don't do well in very cold weather and our tools have enabled us to do so much more. I mean, this is that moment I talk about of getting off of an airplane and thinking, this is crazy. I can fly from New York to San Francisco in like 5 hours or something. So the first time I got to dance with the machine in this way, I felt myself on this big continuum of humans and our tools, everything from fire and the wheel and the printing press all the way up now until AI. And it became so compelling for me and so addictive. It was like cognitively interesting, it was physically interesting.
Hmm.
And I've had so many bizarre experiences on stage with machines that also to me feel like there's a little bit of mysticism. I'll explain that in more detail. So when I gave my first TED Talk, I think it was in 2018, I decided I was going to do a short performance with a robot after I gave the talk. And that piece we had rehearsed 50 times. Everything was perfectly correct. It worked consistently. I was really confident about it. I was also on a little bit of a high because I'd just given this talk. And when we had the hundreds of people who were sitting in the TED Theater at the TED headquarters in New York City, there was a specific part of the piece where I was actually going to kick the robot over. And it was very important because it was meant to symbolize this kind of rejection of technology. And at exactly precisely that moment, the robot just died and fell over. So it literally collapsed at the waist and just fell onto the ground. And the entire meaning of the piece changed because then it went from this human rejecting technology to like, oh, poor machine that isn't capable of
Uh-huh.
taking itself into the future. And it was so spooky. And obviously there were hundreds of people watching, so I wasn't going to pretend, okay, hey, can we start the piece over? But that was just one example of many where you think something's going to turn out a certain way, but because you're working with technology, there's a lot of uncertainties still. Another example of that I can give is last year we did a performance with this 9 foot high robot hand. It's called Manifold from the Exploratorium. We did a show at the Bing Auditorium at Stanford, which is a beautiful 800-seat theater. It was completely sold out. We had 8 dancers performing in it. I didn't perform, but they were all really talented. And the piece literally did not work once until right before the show. I looked at everyone. I said, "We're going to be fine. I have this good feeling that the robot is going to work." And then it did. And I mean, it was very safe for the dancers the entire time because, the way that it was connected, it wasn't going to move in any strange directions. But I've had so many experiences like this where it almost starts to feel mystical. And that is very different than the experience I have when I'm moving with humans.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. It also makes me think that I'm not a dancer, but like in chatting with Claude or pick your LLM, like you're sort of dancing with a robot, not a robot, but dancing with this entity, this alien being, in these conversations that you may be having. Like it is a bit of an uncanny valley feeling because I know I'm not talking to a person, but and it's the way it's programmed. It uses, pronouns like I and we and you. And it gets it's making me rethink sort of how I interact with the things that I'm typing to.
I think this is where philosophers, whether it's Alan Turing or John Searle with the whole Chinese box experiment, have been thinking about these interactions for some time, which is we can ascribe a certain amount of animacy or intelligence to these black box entities. But at the end of the day, it also brings up a lot of interesting questions about people. Do we have a
Yeah.
proclivity to want to lean in um, to the mysticism, or do we have a desire to be told answers to things, or do we want to discover those answers ourselves? I think Shakespeare used to say the purpose of playing, as it were, is to hold a mirror up to nature. That's from Hamlet. So it means the purpose of theater storytelling is in order to hold this mirror up to who we are as humans. And then my dear colleague and good friend Ken Goldberg, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, says something similar, which is robots are mirrors. And you can extend that same metaphor to all kinds of technology. And so the things that we build, they are mirrors of who we are and what we value. And yes, it's interesting to look at these different kinds of thought experiments, whether it's the Turing test or the Chinese box experiment, as, what does it mean about how capable the machine is? But oftentimes I think it's a more sophisticated mirror up into our own tendencies and proclivities.
How do you approach this when it comes to, I know you're thinking a lot about robots of all shapes and types in the home. How do you think, and I know some will be used, I would assume, for sort of care or companionship. Like, how do you approach this question of whether we should be friends, for lack of a better word, with a robot in the house versus, going outside the house and, seeing a friend?
Mhm. Kate Darling has some interesting writing on this where she talks. The name of her book actually is called The New Breed, where she talks about robots also in the context of how we might think about animals and pets, right? We have these hundreds of thousands of years of evolution where humans have come to be create legible relationships with dogs, for example. And you'll hear about, person living in their house with a dog, and it provides them a lot of companionship. And it's also a way to get outside and be healthy and go for walks and things like that. And caretaking. Is it possible to mirror some of those same relationships with robots? I think definitely in the future, certainly now and in the future. And so I think this is where exploding our idea of what these relationships can be, we're just getting started. I mean, there's already a lot of people who say that they're in relationships with ChatGPT or who have AI boyfriends or girlfriends. For that to then be embodied, I think that will definitely happen in the future. Is that a good thing? I'm not sure. I think there's been again, I grew up in the Bay Area. I'm from here. I grew up in Berkeley, and there's always been this promise about techno utopianism, and it's going to
Hmm.
save everything, and we'll be less lonely, we'll be more connected. And it turns out that some of the tools that we've used have actually made us much more polarized, right? So we can't always anticipate a lot of the second and third order effects. What I think is important as a person who's building in this space is to be very clear on what your values are, what your version of the future is that you want to build. The version that I'm interested in the future is one that's inclusive in the sense that anyone knows how to use these tools. I've been really privileged up until this point where I get to use a lot of different kinds of robots in my business research and artwork. And it puts me in a pretty rare seat, just like you described some of your experiences going to South by Southwest and Web Summit and seeing all these robots and having a novel experience with them. I get to have that experience a lot with a lot of different kinds of machines. And it's influenced how the kinds of interactions I want to build, who I want to build for, right? I think whether you're 8 years old or 88, you should be empowered to use a robot and feel that it has some benefit into your life and that it's not making you more alienated, lonely. It doesn't disempower you, right? So I
Yeah.
think as someone building in this space where all of this zeitgeist shows up for me is in underscoring the values that I have as a roboticist, as a designer, as a business leader, and then building on the basis of those values in order to empower a version of the future that I think is the three words that I use: more whimsical, more widely accessible, and more humanistic. Not in the humanoid sense, but in the awesome
Yeah.
for humans sense.
What are the use cases that most excite you?
Well, this is the one that we're we're building at Art Lab. I think one of them is really thinking about a robot as a way of using AI inside of the home. Right now, the way that we use AI is through our laptops and our cell phones. And this vintage of devices, it's actually going on 20 years old. And I think that we're going to have ways of using AI in computing that are just much more up and embodied and pro-social. You can think about it a little bit like if a VR headset was just the environment. So if computing was much more ubiquitous. That's the use case that I'm really excited about, and that's what we're exploring at Art Lab. I think some other things that are going to definitely be valuable. I mean, I talked a little bit about the companion piece. I think I'm more interested in education and cognitive improvements. I've heard about some robots in Japan that are education tutors. For kids, it's hard to sit and look at a screen all day long, but if you have an embodied companion that can talk to you and also give some educational nudges, tutorials, things like that, to me, that sounds like could be a really useful application of robotics in the home. Some other things I'm excited about, I mean, I always think transportation, this fascinating horizon. I never would have thought that self-driving cars would be as good and ubiquitous as they are, but I'm really blown away at how fantastic of an experience it is. And so I'm curious about that in lots of modalities, going farther distances, being in the air,
Yeah.
not only driving. I think self-driving trucking has also become a really interesting application that I've learned a little bit more about recently. So those are some of the things that are exciting to me. But one of the typical ways that people have talked about robots is that they're good at dirty, dull, and dangerous jobs. So things that are too scary for humans to do or are in spaces that are really inaccessible, whether that's super underwater or in really hot areas or locations. I think those all still exist, but it's changing a little bit because of these advances in models that I mentioned.
Yeah, because you're not the first examples you gave are not dirty, dull, dangerous. I mean,
Right.
being in someone's home, being in a school. There was a to me, very, very, very bizarre event at the White House with a humanoid robot designed to teach kids. It walked astride Melania Trump, and then she described it as it would have the entire world's corpus of information, instantly available. Kids could learn from it. I don't know. It begged like a million questions for me. I'm not sure if that's the robot you had in mind when you just mentioned, use in schools. Do you want to react to that actually before I
Oh, definitely not. Yeah, to clarify on that. So this robot, it's actually it's a home tutor. So it's not a robot that you would ever encounter inside of a
got it?
school. You will still have a human teacher from your 9 to 4 p.m. school day. It's more if you went home and you had a small desktop tutor that would accompany you while you're doing your homework, for example. So if you're an 8-year-old and you're sitting there looking at your paper homework and you forget a little bit about how multiplication works or long division. And then there's a small tutor on your desktop who can help chime in verbally and also through a little bit of movement and expression. So very, very different than the idea of, walking into my Cornell Elementary School and having a humanoid robot at the front of the classroom. I mean, I think teachers are some of the backbone of society. It's how we educate a populace. I mean, it's how we give
Yeah.
civic understanding. It's how we also build a lot of emotional resiliency. And, I think the other thing that makes us really special as human beings is not only our ability to leverage and use tools, but the fact that we can coordinate with each other and we can coordinate in large groups and that we're socially, capable. I think that makes us really
Yeah.
extraordinary. And so in no way do I think that we want to remove human teachers from that part of the equation. They're giving us cognitive learnings, but also emotional ones. I think so much about some of the most important characters in my life honestly, all the way up through my PhD, they were all educators. And so do I think that there's an interesting role to play for robots to augment and support some of that as tutors or at home? Yeah, for sure. Do I want to I don't have kids, but if I have kids one day, do I want them to walk into a classroom and not have like Miss Jerry Miller, who was my fourth grade teacher, but have someone else,
Yeah.
that's a robot that's much scarier. That doesn't appeal to me so much. I'm curious what you are excited about with our future with robots.
uh I'm of two minds of this, right? Like I actually have not yet ridden in a self-driving car because I don't live in a city that has them. But I find that really exciting. So a lot of the like very functional things you mentioned, the like cleaning the solar panels and like that all feels very necessary and useful and to the dull, dirty and dangerous. Like I'm excited for all of that. I'm a little wary, I guess, of having a robot in my home. I mean, I told you the experience I had at Web Summit where I saw the canine robot. I didn't know what it was supposed to do, and except I'd seen that horrifying Black Mirror episode where they, you know, doesn't end well. So I don't know. I'm a little wary of bringing it into the home, although I love the vision you just shared of us not being hunched and, opening up our bodies more and moving around. I like that idea. And I totally take the like societal point of we're getting older. The populace is getting older. So I can see the necessity, whether it like makes me feel funny or not, like I can see why this is important. And if we don't have enough nurses, then we need a robot to do some of those jobs or things like that. I can see why they're, going to be increasingly necessary. So it's a good investment right now. I feel like that wasn't the best, what I'm excited about answer. That was a more clinical answer, but that's sort of where I went.
I think this is again where we're hearing so much these days everywhere, right? As agentic. But actually, I think that we have a tremendous amount of agency as to what this future facing world looks like. And in this universe where you can build almost anything and access all kinds of information and make websites with a prompt, make applications with a prompt, make videos, the big question is what are you going to build and why?
Right.
And do you know why you're building what you're building? And I think this is where I am such an advocate for building from a values-based approach and also saying, what's the future I want to live in? And so we're not sitting here talking to each other in 15 years and waxing frustratedly about all of these horrible robots that we're surrounded by, because this is precisely the moment where we get to decide what that future looks like.
Yeah.
And it's both an enormous opportunity and also with all opportunities, they can be positive or negative. And that's where I think we have tremendous responsibility to be considered and capacious about what we want to create in the future.
Yeah. Is there something in the that's being developed now, or is there an anti-pattern that you're observing that a future that you just share what you do want to see in the future? Is there a future that is also being built right now that you don't want to see?
I think there's some massive disparities in economics in the US that are just simply not sustainable. I think it's, a lot of the large AI companies, they were developed as either nonprofits or public benefit corporations. And we're seeing those frameworks be a lot looser, supposedly, than they were
Yeah.
initially. Obviously, a couple of these big companies are responsible for having developed some of the most powerful technology that we've ever had the opportunity to witness. As a person who's written a fair amount, right, who has a PhD and has papers in the general zeitgeist that are accessible online, I have some weird mixed feelings about, whether I got to opt into that or not, right?
Right, right,
So
right.
so
It
I
trained on what you wrote. Yeah.
yeah, and some of the things I said, and these are ideas that I've developed in collaboration with a lot of other people for a long time period. And you could partially make the argument of like, oh, great, well, if they're more accessible to more people via some of these LLM interfaces, then that's a good thing. But I think we just haven't given it enough discussion and thought and time. And I think the future that scares me is one where there's just a lot of inequality. This is where that could be in terms of economics. It could be also access to education, access to tools, access to technology. That's the thing that worries me the most. And I can see some of the forces that are responsible for a lot of that. And I don't see many mitigation efforts in the opposite direction about, and I'm not, by any means a diehard communist or someone someone who wants to change the fabric of the social order. I just think that we need to be having some really important conversations at a much bigger scale than we're having them right now. We need to be thinking about, what does it mean for people in I mean, we're an amazing country. I love America. It's like 330 million people from coast to coast of this gorgeous, abundant land. And so much is possible here. My grandma had a sixth grade education. She rolled cigars for a living, and her granddaughter has a PhD from Stanford. It's like, it's just, I feel tremendous luck and gift. And I think it's about creating more opportunity, maybe for all different kinds of people to use tools. And um, so that's the version of the future that's a little scary to me, is
Yeah.
one where we have some people with enclaves where they have access to all the tools, and then a lot of other people who don't. And so I spend a good chunk of my work also, speaking to young kids and reminding everyone that if you have an interest in technology, I mean, obviously for me, I didn't have an undergraduate degree in engineering, but I got to get a PhD in it, and trying to remind everyone that there's space for you. And if whether you're interested in soccer or fashion or cooking, and you want to explore the intersection of that with robotics, there's going to be a world for you. And so I try to remind kids of that, especially, a lot, because I can feel that the vibes are not always immaculate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're thinking about, what does the future look like for me.
I love your story. Is there something that you hope that the builders who are listening right now will do differently going forward?
I think I mean, this is also a little bit of inspiration from Michael Pollan's book, but he talks about like getting out of your own bubble a little bit. I'm in such a bubble here in Silicon Valley. Oh my goodness. I mean, between Stanford and startup founders, and I really like, I feel myself being in a little bit of a bubble with a lot of people who are thinking about similar ideas or possibilities to me. And getting outside of that has been tremendously valuable, whether that's travel to different parts of the world, or hanging out with people who are outside of my immediate field, which is robot learning, and even touching grass, kind of just like having a mix of experiences that are much more eclectic. I mean, I talk a lot about getting some inspiration from my dad and his experience. His life is really different than mine. I mean, he immigrated to the US in his late 30s. His relationship to technology, it's much less native for him. And so I think about building for people like him a lot. And so I think getting outside of your own bubble, it's healthy for everyone. And it's
Hmm.
something I think that can also foster more shared connection and remind us like that we really have most things in common. We all care about being safe and taking good care of our families, and feeling that our lives are moving in a positive direction. Those are things that almost all human beings have in common. And so my invitation is always, how can we push beyond the bounds of our immediate circles and cells, and nudge up into other spaces that are different.
Yeah, awesome. Catie, thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. Great to be here.
This is Future Around and Find Out, and I am so excited to keep exploring with you, to keep steering the future in the right direction. Go to futurearound.com to get the newsletter, to ask questions of upcoming guests, and to find more ways that we can build a better future together.